Good morning, Gulfshoresman here, and I have got a treat for you today. I've got Mr. Robert Stoney, the Director of Sustainability at the Gulf State Park. Good morning, Mr. Stoney. How are you? Welcome.
Good, very good. Hi, Scott.
Well, we're going to talk about some composting today, huh?
Absolutely. I want
Well,
to
I'm
show you
excited.
what we're doing here. This is basically state-of-the-art, educational and functional composting, very simple. And we'll go through the process and show you what we're doing here. We have 3 composting units here. This is one. They're kind of basically boxes that are just underground or below ground. There's one over there at the end and there's one there. And each of those 3, or just those 3 in total, are enough to be able to provide the nourishment, the nutrients for all of this growing area and more, in fact, because we actually produce a surplus.
So how much does one of these boxes cost for our viewers?
Well, you can actually get these, we bought these online, and I think that the basic pack runs at around $1.99. But of course, you can make your own if you wanted to. You could make your own with a couple of milk crates or tomato crates, because what they are is they're just these basic crates here with holes, and these holes are very important. I'll come back to that in a minute. The only thing you don't get, of course, is all this fancy stuff here on the lid and this insulation here, which is actually quite important.
Yes, sir.
But this kind of feeding guide and what you can put in and what you can't put in is very useful for our purposes, because it's kind of an educational thing. But yeah, any kind of container that's got these perforations, little holes, because this allows the worms to travel in and out freely. And it's the worms that are doing the work for you. This is not really complicated. You should just basically set it up right, and the worms will do the work for you.
So any backyard gardener can do this, huh?
Any backyard gardener or anyone who's remotely keen on gardening not only can do it but should do it, because this is a couple of things. This is really, really a cheap way of feeding plants. It's a wonderful environmental thing to do because you're recycling. And it's probably the best way of feeding plants, because you're feeding them a kind of a steak and chip dinner as opposed to just kind of pills, which is what you get. In pills, I liken kind of artificial fertilizers to like feeding somebody on a drip feed or a pill, and you have to be very specific and careful. With compost, you just give them a good meal and it's enough for them.
And it's working amazing.
And
look at this.
Yeah, it is. It is extraordinary, the growth. I mean, this is a combination not just of the wonderful compost, but the incredible climate we have here in the state park. So basically very easy. You just put in layers of material. So food scrap waste. We use a lot of the kitchen waste, the food prep waste from the back of Woodside Restaurant.
Yes, sir.
In fact, we can actually process all of their food scrap waste, things like coffee grounds and eggshells and all those kind of peelings and things like that. And you mix that in layers, roughly layers of green stuff and brown stuff. So I like to use kind of straw or mulchy material or pine straw, or even paper. You can use shredded paper. I've got a whole selection of things over there we can use.
Yeah, we're going to go over there in a few minutes and look at another demonstration over there.
Yeah. Well,
so when do you take and put this side over into this side?
Well, the whole process takes, from beginning to end at this time of the year, you can go from that to the finished compost in about 6 to 8 weeks.
That's
the
incredible.
worms are very, very quick.
Yeah.
So what you're doing is basically adding up, and then you may have to turn it a couple of times within that 6 to 8 weeks period. I kind of just go in here and turn it manually, but you can get these kind of augers, manual augers, or you can use an auger on a drill, but it's kind of a bit hard on the worms, I think, so that's why I like to do it like this. And then, of course, if you have this side empty, you can actually just tip the contents of this one to that one, and that will be as good as an aeration. But what's fascinating is that you can see this actually working right here in real time. If you look down in here, you'll see, first of all, you'll see the worms wriggling around, working away. They're a bit docile at the moment because it's so hot. Well, there's one that's quite active. But you can also see these tiny little root hairs that are coming through the holes. So these plants around about here are actually nourishing themselves directly from the compost before we even put it out and spread it, which just shows you how effective it is. So that's pretty much complete. This is in process. This will also heat up, and as it heats up, it probably gets too hot for the worms, so the worms will migrate out into the soil and then come back in when it's cooled down.
Do you ever have to add any liquid to it?
You do sometimes, yes, good point, because sometimes it gets so hot it'll actually dry itself out. You can almost see the steaming. It'll heat up to about 140 degrees sometimes, which is actually quite a nice thing to happen, because it'll sort of pasteurize it naturally. It sort of heats up to kill weed seeds and other things that you might not want in there. But It doesn't have to heat up to that height, but of course that will dry it out, so you sometimes have to add water.
Well,
And
excellent.
yeah, so there we go, and you have this very handy dandy list here of things that you can, the feeding steps, the amount that you can feed per week, and of course this guide here. The only thing you don't want to put in here are meat and dairy products, cigarette butts and so on, but it's amazing what you can put in the way of food scrap waste. You can compost eggshells, coffee grounds are really excellent. Seafood waste, bits of shrimp shells. Actually, you can use ground oyster shells and so on. So, there's a whole lot of opportunities for composting.
Well, this is fantastic, and it's obviously working very well. Look at the growth on this little garden here. It's amazing.
Thanks. Yes, it is. Yeah, sure.
Okay, Mr. Stoney, we're over here at the demonstration table, and we'd like to tell the viewers exactly what some of this stuff is and how we use it, and the amounts that we use and why we use it.
Yeah, sure. So this is really just for those who want to kind of get a little bit more geeky about composting, to actually explain what's going on and to show you some of the things that you can actually add, that you don't actually have to just limit yourself to what you're growing in the garden and the food scrap waste. There are all sorts of other materials that you can add. Basically, what you're trying to do, without getting too complicated, is to have half brown stuff and half green stuff. The green stuff has the nitrogen in it, which gives the kick. That's the magic. That has, if you like, the high octane. And then the brown is really just the carbon. You have to have some of that to actually act as a structure for the composting process. So we kind of vaguely classify things into brown material and green material. So if you look at here what we got on the table, the typical brown material obviously would be something like straw, either regular wheat straw or this pine straw. You can use a little bit of that. I wouldn't use too much of that because this is really kind of dry. Mm-hmm. You can even use cardboard here. You can just tear up bits of cardboard and put in.
How much can you put in of cardboard?
Yeah, good question. You can actually put in probably around 5 to 10% in layers. And the same for this paper waste, even though this shredded paper is white, we call this brown because it's part of the carbon side. And again, you can add really quite a lot of this. I'd say probably 10% by volume in layers. So those are the typical, and this is a great way of recycling, by the way. You probably don't want to use too much kind of colored ink paper, although most of the inks these days are non-toxic, but I prefer to use, if I can get less
You wouldn't
coloring.
want to use anything shiny like wrapping paper or anything like that?
I don't know anything with a plastic in it, but this stuff here is perfect. That's just regular paper waste.
And this looks just like regular grass clippings.
Absolutely.
They all got lots of those.
Yep, absolutely. These are a perfect source of nitrogen. Again, you don't want to add too much because this can heat and it can actually
get too hot.
Even start smoldering. Yeah,
Wow.
I've seen this almost smolder and catch fire, and again, that's another issue.
Well, I grew up on a farm, and if we put hay up wet, it would mold and get hot.
Exactly.
And catch the barn on fire.
Yeah, exactly the same thing. And it's basically what it is. It's kind of it's the first stage of hay, and then of course all the plant material waste, again cut up into little pieces and so on. Yeah, always have your water handy to kind of keep it wet down at this time of the year. So
what is this?
Well, this is my new secret weapon here. This is stuff called biochar, which is a kind of fancy type of charcoal. It's charcoal made in a particular way. You can see here it's all ground up into a powder.
It's pretty fine.
Very fine, but what this is a material that can actually capture the nutrients and hold them there pretty much forever in the soil. This stuff here, because it's heat treated, the actual structure of the wood that it's made from is still, the microstructure is still there, and each of these little granules has an enormous surface area. Apparently 1 little gram, which is about the size of a pea, if you were to look at that under a microscope, you see all these tiny little holes, and if you kind of flattened all those holes out, it would cover the surface of a tennis court.
Wow.
It's a huge surface area, and and what you do with this basically is you can add it dry, but it's much better to charge it. You really have to put it into a bucket like I have here. I've got a bucket of the material here, and then you add water to this, and then you can add various nutrients to this to charge it up, because if you don't, when it's kind of raw and in its early stages, it will actually rob the nutrients for the first year. So you have to kind of provide some nutrients. I use things like this blood meal here that can go in.
Well, that's pretty high in nitrogen,
which is very high in nitrogen. Well, actually not very high. It's about 3 to 4% nitrogen, but again, it is a nitrogen source. You can also use this fish fertilizer, which is terrific. This is actually this is wonderful because it's kind of got a balance of NP and K. Stinks like mad, but if it stinks, it works. And again, you
I've
leave
used that
that
on tomato plants for years.
Yeah,
I make
yeah.
I make a soup out of it.
Excellent. That's exactly what we're doing here. We're making a soup, but we're kind of making that soup go into the little tiny pores and stay there. And then this stuff here, when you actually spread it around or you put it in underneath the plants, it will hold those nutrients for quite literally years. Some of this stuff was actually used by the ancient Amazonian people.
Wow.
And they've had, because they have problems with soil fertility out in the Amazon jungle. And they've been making this. They didn't know quite what they were making. They just knew that it was effective. And the soils with this, the so-called terra preta, the black soils of the Amazon, are still giving up their nutrients and still fertile hundreds and hundreds of years after.
So it'll
they've been,
hold carbon?
done. It's carbon, but it'll hold all the N, P, and K, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and the micronutrients in there forever and ever. But it also holds carbon, as you're right, it does hold carbon as well. So it's actually a great way of sequestering carbon. So these days, we're looking for ways of actually holding carbon. This is a terrific way of doing that.
So they needed this in Oklahoma before the Dust Bowl, huh?
They absolutely, yeah, they did.
Prevented that.
And it is, and it's very interesting because this is suddenly becoming a thing here. I mean, it's not really suitable for northern latitudes, or at least it's less suitable, but it's in a subtropical or a hot climate, it's really, really effective. And of course, as the weather patterns are changing, of course, it will be, it'll become more useful further north as the
Well, that's great,
weather
Mr.
changes.
Stoney. This has been a wonderful demonstration. This is Gulfshoresman with Robert Stoney again, and we're going to do some more interviews with him in the future, so look forward to that.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.